Hi, I'm Marina from Frocks Frolics, and we're carrying on with our sew along for the Charlie Brown coat, and we're using the Ottobre magazine, and you can get that for yourself so you can sew with me. And this time we're going to put the shell together, and it's going to be absolutely beautiful. So shoulder seams, side seams, and the back. First we're going to put the center back seam on top of each other, and we want to join that just 1 centimeter lower than the rough edge. So we have got the seam allowance here, and we're going to pin that together. There's a slight little curve in there. I think it looks very nice when it's finished. So put a few pins in, and we're going to sew this together now. And make sure that, of course, the right sides are on the inside, and we're going to lock in our stitches, and then we're going to sew this together. Seam allowance of 1 centimeter, and right to that point where we've got our pin in there, which shows us, how far we have to sew. And sometimes the fabric wants to push a bit, and you want to make sure that you don't let it. So don't do this too fast, and you can hold the fabric rather taut and push it in. So we're going to that horizontal pin, lock in your stitches, and now we do the same as ever. I'm going to just steam it with a damp cloth again, so that it's a nice flat seam. And as always, what you want to do is leave it on until it's dry in that area. And now it's nice and flat. I don't need the weight now. We're going to do that later. It gives you just a really nice result. And now we're going to do the vent at the bottom. And now it's of course quite important that we get that lying into the right direction. And on your instructions, it says fold the seam allowance towards the right back panel and top stitch the seam. Now, sometimes you're not quite sure which is the right back panel because it depends which way you look at it. So an easy way to see which way it has to lie, either to the right or to the left, is to take your pattern piece and just pop it on top. This is the lining, which was cut out right sides up. So however that fits, it will be right. So in this case, you have to take your seam allowance and it goes towards yourself. That's it. So we're taking that wet cloth again now, and we're ironing it towards ourselves. And again, you leave it on until it is dry. And then we're going to put our weight on it. You can use any weight you have got, doesn't have to be a tailor's clapper. And now I'm also going to press my vent at the lower end here, so I get a really nice fold. And again, I'm using my wet cloth. I put that on as well. Wait until it's all dry, and then I can lift it off and put my weight on again, and I get a really nice edge. And all these little steps that we're doing now will really help with doing the vent. When I'll see you next time, we're not going to finish the vent, but we're going to prep it up fully so it's ready to go. I prefer to do all these parts in one go when I put the lining in. We are just going to top stitch right to the point to which we have sewn the vent together. And just to get this right, I can put a pin in here, and we're not going to lock our stitches in. That doesn't look very good. We want it to look like it's one line to go in here later on, but we're not doing that now. We're doing that when we're finished. And so the first thing to do is to top stitch this all the way down. And I started at the vent this time because that is the easiest way to do. For me, at least as a right-hander, you want to have the stitching line, the seam on the right-hand side of yourself. All the way down. Here you can lock in your stitches if you like, that's fine. And then I'm just going to sew away the lower one here. You need a sewing needle with a really big eye, and I pull that through to the other side, and then we're just going to move out the thread here. Very often it leaves you a little loop like that. That just happens, so don't worry about it. All you need to do is pull that out, and once you've done that, you can knot them off as we always do, and that's it. And then we can just sew it away. And if you're wondering what this is now because you've stumbled across this video on YouTube, then I would suggest that you find the playlist, which is linked in the description, and you can watch all the other videos for this coat as well, and you can make yourself one of these beautiful Pea-Coats. Really nice. The Ottobre magazine calls it a Charlie Brown coat. I think that's very cute as well, but I would call it a Pea-Coat. It's really nice, double-breasted, and you're gonna love it. And the little girl you can see modeling there, that's Magdalena, and she took this coat to school. And if kids wear it to school, you know you've done a good job. So now I'm done here. If my vent stands over, if one is longer than the other, you can trim that at this stage. And now we're going to put the yoke on. So right sides together, just flip it over. Make sure that the center back of the yoke and the back piece sit on top of each other. You can pin it or leave the pins out. I tend to not pin it because it's so thick. Where is it going to go, right? So I'm going to go over to the sewing machine now, bang this thing together by holding just the ends and holding the center, and then I know, okay, that's where it needs to go, and then I sew together, make sure that the rough edges are on top of each other, and we have a 1 centimeter seam allowance. As always, we put that onto the pattern pieces. With Ottobre, you do not get your seam allowance included, so you need to add that when you do the pattern piece. And now I'm going to pull this over to this side, and the seam stands into the yoke, and I put my wet cloth over the top as always, and then we're going to press this before we top stitch it so that it looks really nice. Of course you could just top stitch it straight away, but I tell you what, it's not going to look as pristine, so I would suggest you don't leave out these little work steps, because in the end it's going to look absolutely fab. So put your weight on again until there's no more steam to be seen going out, and then you do the other side, and then we can pop over to the sewing machine and top stitch it. And when you top stitch any of the stuff where you don't see the underside, you can just leave a blue thread, you know, standard Gutermann thread in the bobbin, and we're only using the top stitching thread from the top. And the other thing to remember when you do the top stitching is that you want it to be on tension 8, I think, on my machine at least it is. You need to check that out, maybe what is the appropriate one for your sewing machine, but basically the tension needs to be very high. And I'm using a stitch length 3.5. On some sewing machines actually 4 would be even better. You want a nice long stitch. If it's too small, it will not look as professional. It looks really poxy, not very nice. So check out what is appropriate for your sewing machine and what you like, and then you stick to that same top stitching length all the way through. So now here, because I didn't want my machine to get stuck, I didn't start with locking in my stitches, I only did it at the end. So I'm double knotting them, and then I'm going to pull the threads away. It's all quite work intense, this, when you do proper tailoring, but this does make your life easier, because what happens when you start at the very beginning, it usually just hammers on the same spot when you use top stitching thread especially. And pulled it away, just cut it off, and now we're ready to put the shoulders together. Put the shoulders together, right sides on the inside or together. And again, you don't need to overpin this. I would just put a pin in the corner of each shoulder, and that's it really. That's absolutely fine. You don't need to necessarily pin any of this. You know, experienced seamstresses just go on the machine and bang it together. Here we lock in our stitches. Of course, we're just using the regular thread here, so I had to unthread it again, of course, and you can start hearing my sewing machine is sounding really rough. It's very hard, the sound it makes, which means really it needs oiling. So I ended up swapping machines because I didn't have any sewing machine oil here, and you don't ever want to go too far because you're going to ruin the motor and then your machine is just broken. So when you have these sort of really heavy noises, you should stop sewing and say, okay, I'm going to oil this baby first. Now I'm going to iron my seam allowances apart. In the Ottobre magazine, it says to iron them towards the front and then top stitch them. But I didn't want my very heavy fabric sticking in there when I do the collar, because it's going to be really, really thick anyway. So I'm going to do a top stitching line on either side, and that's number one. It looks really good, and then it'll make it a little bit easier for when I put in my sleeve and my collar. So you find a marking on your presser foot, that's good for you, and then you keep doing that same one throughout the whole coat really. And for me that was one stitch down was hitting my seam line and one stitch over and then back down. And I of course do that on both sides. Locking your stitches at the end, and you've got a really good looking shoulder here. Brilliant. So pretty. Now I'm going to close my side seams as well. And again, do I need to pin this? If that was just me sewing for myself, I would just pop on over and just sew it together. But of course you can pin this if you like. And it is really good that I've removed here that centimeter from the seam allowance, because that makes it extra thick in there. And then also I thought if I was going to do this again, I would have the seam allowance 1.5 on the side seam, because that would give me a bit more stability. And when you look at clothes that are made in industry, usually that seam is wider than the other seams. But it is no hardship if you've done it with a centimeter, it's fine. But if I did it again, I would do 1.5 centimeters, I think. And again, hold the fabric nice and taut so that the fabric can't push. With my fabric, it wasn't such a big deal, but you do get that sometimes, like if you're working with velvet, that really would push. So holding it nice and taut, or even basting it first, that's another option you can do when you find my fabric pushes and then one end ends up longer than the other. So now I'm going to just check my lengths, and if they're not quite right, you can trim it off, right? So if it's only a tiny bit, don't do it again. Just trim it so it's nice and even all the way over. And then I take my trusty wet cloth again, or damp cloth, and my tailor's clapper. And again, I'm doing my seams apart here, and you can top stitch on either side if you like. You'll get really used to that little cloth, and you can even use a handkerchief for this. This is just something I've got in my workshop. I've got a roll of very light white cotton, which I also use for linings and petticoats and such. So now I'm going to top stitch that either side. And again, you could just iron the seam to one side and then top stitch it. But I'll tell you what, I think it's nicer if it's a little bit flatter, especially if you have very thick fabric. Is your fabric quite thin? You're using a thin wool, then you don't need to do that. But I think that's just better. Even if it's more top stitching, I needed 2 reels of top stitching thread actually in the end. And I had to go to the shop and buy another one because I bought 2 in the beginning, if you haven't seen that video, and I got a wrong color. I got 2 different colors, so in the end I needed 2 reels, so I had to pop out and get one. And now if you have got some stitches left out, which happens, it's not unusual for household machines to do that, no matter how good they are. So what we do is we thread up with the bobbin thread, and then we just come through on one side of that stitching where it's left out the stitch, go back on the other side and pull it in, and we simulate basically the stitching, and then it looks just right. So don't think you have to undo anything when you have these left out stitches. Just sew the thread away on the other side and nobody will ever know. And it looks absolutely beautiful. Really nice. And down here I will pull them away again, knot and pull away. I'm not showing that again. Now I'm going to put on the strips that we prepared at the very beginning for our hems. And I'm not going to put this into the seam allowance, of course, and here I cut off the bit for the seam allowance as well because it makes it unnecessarily thick. And if you remember, we want to put this interfacing on so that where the hem is turned up is a fold of interfacing, and that gives you a really beautiful edge. So don't put your interfacing just at the top to the point where you turn up. You want it to go right over that. Make sure it sticks. Do it on the other side as well. And here I'm only going to the point where we have the fold line. We ironed that in so I can see it quite nicely as to where I have to go. And now I'm going to press that down as well. And I'm using a woven interfacing for this, the same as I've used on the front piece. That gives it real stability. I love those. They are really, really nice. Great. Now I'm also going to stabilize the edge here because that's going to be folded over, and I want that to sit really nice as well. So this is a bit of an afterthought, and I don't think that Ottobre specified that either, but I think it's a good idea to do it. So let's just put a little strip of interfacing where you've got the fold line for your vent and put that on as well. And that will give me a really nice edge. Brilliant. The last thing we want to do in this little part is we want to prep up our vent to make sure that when we sew it on with the lining, everything goes perfectly. So we're going to turn it up now as it is on the pattern. So I quickly checked what it was, and it's 4.5 centimeters. And so you just measure that and then you turn it up to that point and you give that a jolly good press. And in your Ottobre instructions, it will actually tell you at this point to, hang on, where is it? Place right back when facing and bottom hem allowances right sides together and stitch seam to form the bottom hem corner. I'm working that slightly different. It's not much different, but I'm leaving that step until I put my lining in because it gives me a cleaner edge, and you will see why. You could do it as they tell you here, that will be no issue. You could do that at this point, but I prefer to do it later. And we're just finishing off our piece here with all the hems ironed up. And again, that makes it easier later on to put the lining in and do all this because you know that that's exactly right. Once you've ironed up all your hems, you might want to put the fronts together and see that that's exactly on top of each other, just to make sure that it's all good and straight, basically. And again, we're using the wet cloth and we're putting the weight on, and then it will come out absolutely beautiful. And that's another step ticked off. And now I'm just going to fold my vent over exactly as it's going to be. And I'm going to press that again as well, because there's always a slight difference between the part that you fold over and the part which is the long side of the hem. Always. So if you just sew them together edge to edge, you'll get like a tiny little nose in there, and you don't want that. It's way easier if you do it like this, because now you can see where we're going to sew it together later because you've got that lovely line. And that, my friends, we're going to do when we put the lining in. So I'll see you next time where we're going to work the sleeve and put it in. Until then, bye for now.